Jedediah Stone felt the weight of the Montana sky pressing down on him, a vast and indifferent expanse of blue that offered no judgment and no forgiveness. It had been 5 years since he'd known a freedom that wasn't edged with the sharp taste of regret. 5 years since his world had shrunk to the size of a stone cell and the measure of his own failings. Now, riding into the town of Crimson Peak, perched precariously in a valley carved by wind and time, he understood that a prison could be built of more than just iron bars. It could be built of memory, of reputation, and of the cold, hard stares of strangers. His mare, a weary beast whose ribs showed faintly beneath her dusty coat, seemed to share his exhaustion, her steps slow and deliberate on the town's main street. A ribbon of packed dirt that felt as unwelcoming as the granite cliffs that loomed over it. The town itself seemed to hold its breath as he passed. Faces in the windows of the general store turned to stone. Conversations on the groaning boardwalks faltered and died, and the silence that followed him was heavier than any sound. Jed kept his gaze fixed between his horse's ears, his shoulders set against the invisible tide of whispers he knew were rising in his wake. His clothes, worn thin from the trail, hung loosely on a frame that had been whittled down by prison rations and hard labor. But the breadth of his shoulders still spoke of a life spent in the saddle and under the sun. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, hiding the faint scar that traced a path along his jawline. A permanent reminder of the night that had cost him everything. He wasn't looking for trouble, nor was he looking for redemption. He knew such a thing was not for men like him. He was looking for work, for a chance to earn a meal in a bed of hay, a chance to simply exist without the constant echo of his past. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the only establishment that seemed to pulse with any life. The swing doors creaked open to reveal a room thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and sawdust. For a brief moment, the low hum of conversation continued, but then a single patron looked up, his eyes narrowing in recognition, and a chill spread through the room as if a winter wind had blown the doors wide. Every head turned, every gaze fixed upon him, and the room fell silent. Jed stood in the doorway, his hat in his hand, feeling the familiar weight of being judged and found wanting. He approached the bar, his boots making soft, lonely sounds on the wooden floor, and met the bartender's hostile glare. The man's hands were flat on the bar, his knuckles white, as if bracing for a fight. Jed spoke, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "Just looking for a day's work. Anything you might have?" The bartender let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "We don't have work for your kind here," he said, his voice loud enough for every man in the room to hear. "Keep riding." Jed did not argue. He had learned in the harshest of schools that arguing with a man who had already condemned you was a fool's errand. He simply nodded, a slow, tired acknowledgement, placed his hat back on his head, and turned to leave. The silence held until the doors swung shut behind him, and only then did the murmur of voices resume. Sharp and venomous, the word killer echoing in the space he left behind. He tried the livery stable, the blacksmith, and even offered to haul freight. But the answer was always the same, a shake of the head. A door closed quietly in his face, an aversion of the eyes that was more painful than any shouted insult. By late afternoon, the sun began its slow descent, painting the sharp peaks of the surrounding mountains in hues of blood orange and violet. And Jed found himself back at the edge of town, the bitter taste of failure coating his tongue. His hunger was a dull ache in his stomach, matched only by the deeper ache of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound. He was an island, a man cast out, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Miles away, in the very valley that Silas Croft coveted. Alara Vance worked the land with a grim determination that had been her constant companion since her husband's death. The soil was unforgiving, the sun relentless, and the work was too much for one woman and a boy. But she refused to yield. Her hands, though calloused and rough, moved with a practiced grace as she mended a section of fence. Her son, Caleb, working silently beside her, his small face a mask of concentration as he handed her the tools. At 8 years old, he had already learned the hard lessons of the frontier that life was a struggle. That loss was a constant shadow, and that survival depended on the strength you found within yourself. The Vance Ranch, nestled in a sweep of land that held the only reliable creek in the region, was their whole world, a legacy of sweat and dreams that Alara had sworn to protect. That legacy, however, was now under siege. Silas Croft had been circling like a vulture for months, his visits becoming more frequent, his offers more insistent. He was a man whose ambition was as vast and cold as the Montana winters, a land baron who saw people not as souls but as obstacles or assets. He arrived that afternoon in his polished black buggy, a stark and predatory shape against the rugged landscape. He did not waste time with pleasantries, his smile thin and without warmth as he laid out his final offer. A sum that was an insult to the value of the land and the life her family had poured into it. "The railroad is coming, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Progress waits for no one. A woman alone, with a boy. This is no place for you. It's a man's world." He spoke of progress, but Alara saw only greed. She knew, as did he, that it wasn't just the land he wanted, it was the water, the lifeblood of the valley, which would be worth a fortune when the iron horse arrived. Caleb stood behind her, his small hand clutching her skirt, his eyes wide with a fear he was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel. Alara placed a protective hand on his shoulder, her spine straight, her gaze unwavering as she met Croft's cold eyes. "This is my home, Mr. Croft," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "It is not for sale." Croft's smile tightened, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the ruthless predator beneath. "A pity," he said, before climbing back into his buggy. "Winter is coming. It would be a shame for you and the boy to face it alone." The threat was unspoken but clear, hanging in the air long after the dust from his carriage had settled. Alara watched him go, her heart a cold knot of fear and defiance in her chest. She was alone, and the wolves were circling. It was in this moment of quiet desperation that Jed Stone, having ridden out of town with no destination in mind, saw her. He had been about to push on, to disappear into the vast wilderness, when he saw the black buggy pulling away and the woman standing by the fence line, a small boy clinging to her side. He couldn't hear their words, but he could read the story in her posture, the rigid set of her shoulders, the proud tilt of her chin, the fierce, protective way she shielded her son. He saw in her the same stubborn refusal to be broken that had kept him alive for 5 long years. Every instinct screamed at him to keep riding, to avoid entangling himself in the troubles of others. But something held him there. It was the sight of the boy, perhaps, or the stark loneliness of the landscape that seemed to mirror his own. With nothing left to lose, he nudged his mare forward, approaching slowly so as not to startle them. He stopped a respectful distance away, dismounting and holding the reins in his hand. Alara turned, her body tensing, her hand instinctively pulling Caleb closer as she studied the stranger. She saw a man worn down by hardship, his eyes holding a deep, haunted weariness she recognized all too well. She saw the dust of the road, the mark of a drifter, but she also saw a quiet dignity in the way he held himself, a stillness that was not threatening. Jed removed his hat, his gaze direct and honest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet, "I couldn't help but see you might have more work than 2 pairs of hands can manage. I'm looking for a job, any job. I'm a hard worker and I ask for nothing more than meals and a place in the barn." Her mind raced. The town's whispers had already reached her, carried on the wind like poison. She knew who he was, or at least, who they said he was. Every rational thought told her to send him away, to protect her son from a man with a violent past. But then she looked at the sagging roof of her barn, the endless lengths of fence that needed mending, and the encroaching shadow of Silas Croft. She looked at her own calloused hands and then at the stranger's, which were large and capable. She saw not a killer, but a man as desperate and cornered as she was. In that moment, standing between the threat she knew and the risk she didn't, Alara Vance made a choice. It was a choice born not of logic, but of a shared and unspoken understanding of what it meant to be alone against the world. "The barn needs a new roof before the first snow," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And the pay is $20 a month." She saw a flicker of disbelief, then a wave of profound relief wash over the man's face. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he finally managed. "You won't regret this." As Jedstone led his horse toward the barn, Ilara knew she had just invited the storm into her home. But she also felt, for the first time in a long time, the faintest glimmer of hope. The first light of dawn found Jedstone already at work, the rhythmic rasp of his handsaw against aging timber a solitary sound in the vast morning silence. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a man long accustomed to channeling his thoughts and his ghosts into the simple, honest language of labor. There was a purity in the work, a clear line between effort and result that had been absent from the moral chaos of his past. Each plank he measured and cut for the barn roof, each nail he drove home with a steady, practiced hand, was a small act of reconstruction, not just for the dilapidated structure, but for the man himself. He worked through the day without pause, fueled by the bread and coffee Ilara left for him on the porch steps, a silent offering that marked the boundary of their fragile arrangement. Ilara watched him from the kitchen window, her initial apprehension warring with a growing sense of grudging respect. She had expected a man haunted by violence to carry that violence in his movements. But Jed's presence was the opposite. He was a figure of profound stillness, his energy coiled and contained, directed only at the task before him. He did not speak unless spoken to, and his answers were short and to the point. Yet there was no insolence in his silence. It was the quiet of a man who had learned that words were often treacherous things, capable of inflicting wounds as deep as any blade. She saw the way his eyes, the color of worn slate, took in every detail of the struggling ranch, the fences that needed tightening, the corral gate that hung on a single hinge, the dry patch of earth that could be irrigated with a bit of effort, and she realized he saw not just a job, but a world that needed mending. Caleb was a more cautious observer, a small shadow flitting at the edges of Jed's workspace. For days, he kept his distance, his curiosity warring with the fearful stories he had overheard in town. He watched Jed handle the horses, his large, scarred hands moving with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the man's reputation. There was a moment when the boy's favorite pony, a spirited colt named Flicker, shied from a falling piece of timber. Before Caleb could cry out, Jed was there, not grabbing or shouting, but simply placing his body between the horse and the perceived danger, speaking in a low, calming murmur until the animal's trembling subsided. He then turned to Caleb, not with a smile, but with a serious, respectful nod, as if acknowledging the boy's own fear. It was the first bridge built between them, a silent pact of understanding. The true connection was forged a week later, over the simple task of repairing a broken axe handle. Caleb had been trying to fix it himself, his small hands struggling with the unfamiliar tools. Jed, on his way to the creek, stopped and watched for a long moment before approaching. He did not take the tool away, but knelt beside the boy, his large frame casting a long shadow. "You hold the wood against the grain when you shave it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Like this." He guided Caleb's hands, showing him how to angle the knife, how to feel the subtle shifts in the wood, teaching him the patience the task required. He spoke of the wood as if it were a living thing, with its own strengths and weaknesses, and Caleb listened, utterly captivated. In those quiet moments, Jed was not an ex-convict. He was a teacher, a craftsman, a man who understood the hidden language of the world. He was filling a void in the boy's life that Caleb himself had not fully understood was there, the quiet, steady presence of a father. As the weeks bled into a month, a tentative rhythm established itself on the Vance ranch. It was a rhythm of shared work and comfortable silence, of meals eaten with a careful distance at the kitchen table, of evenings spent on the porch where the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and Caleb's soft questions about the stars. It was during one of these quiet evenings, with the sky bleeding from purple to indigo, that the past finally found its voice. Ilara, darning a pair of Caleb's overalls, finally asked the question that had been sitting like a stone in her heart since the day he arrived. "Crimson Peak isn't your home," she stated, her eyes on her needlework. "Where did you come from?" Jed was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the darkening horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. "I came from the territorial prison in Yuma." The needle in Ilara's hand stilled. She felt Caleb, sitting on the step below her, go rigid. She had known. Of course. But hearing the words spoken aloud in the peaceful twilight gave them a terrible new weight. She had to ask the next question, though she feared the answer. Why? Jed's hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists for a brief second before relaxing. There was a fight, he said, his voice flat. A man died. He offered no excuses, no justifications, no pleas for understanding. He simply laid the unvarnished truth between them, a hard and ugly thing. The confession hung in the air, cold and sharp, and in that moment, he had given her every reason to send him away. But as she looked at his profile, silhouetted against the last light of day, she saw not a monster, but a man carrying an impossible burden. A man who had chosen to face her with the worst part of himself rather than a comforting lie. Her fear remained, but it was now joined by a complex, unsettling flicker of trust. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. The shadow of Silas Croft was long, and his foreman, Bart Thorne, was a man who reveled in cruelty. The harassment began as a series of small, unsettling incidents, designed to fray their nerves and sow doubt. A freshly mended section of fence was found cut during the night, not enough for cattle to escape, but a clear message. The latch on the chicken coop was left open, scattering the hens and leaving them vulnerable to predators. These were wounds that could not be proven, acts that could be dismissed as accidents or bad luck. And that was their poison. It created a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, a feeling of being watched, of being besieged by an enemy who refused to show his face. Jed would find the damage each morning and repair it without a word, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the ridgeline that overlooked the ranch. The true escalation came on a hot, still afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, and an unnatural quiet had fallen over the valley. Caleb was in the corral, proudly attempting to brush down Flicker, mimicking the gentle motions he had learned from Jed. Alara watched from the porch, a small smile on her face. When the sound cut through the silence, the dry, electric buzz of a rattlesnake, it was a sound that spoke of sudden, violent death. Flicker, smelling the danger, reared back, his eyes rolling in terror, his hooves striking the wooden rails of the corral with a panicked thud. Caleb froze, a small statue of pure fear, his back to the coiled serpent that lay half hidden in the shade of a water trough, its tail a blur of motion, before Alara's scream could fully form in her throat. Jed moved. He had been splitting firewood by the barn, and he seemed to materialize in the corral as if from the earth itself. There was no panic in him, only a terrifying, focused calm. His first action was not for the snake, but for the horse and boy. "Caleb, don't move," he commanded, his voice low but sharp with authority, cutting through the boy's paralysis. In the same motion, he grabbed an empty grain sack hanging from a post and, with a flick of his wrist, threw it over Flicker's head. Blinding the panicking animal, he gentled the horse with one hand, murmuring to it, while his eyes never left the snake. With the horse momentarily under control, he pushed Caleb gently but firmly behind him, shielding the boy with his own body. Only then did he turn his full attention to the threat. He picked up a long-handled pitchfork that was leaning against the fence, his movements fluid and certain. The confrontation was over in seconds, a swift and brutal act of necessity that left the snake dead in the dust. He stood for a moment, breathing heavily, the pitchfork still in his hand. He then dropped it, the clatter loud in the sudden silence, and knelt in front of Caleb, placing his hands on the boy's trembling shoulders. He checked him for injury, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle, before looking him squarely in the eye. "You did good, son," he said softly. "You stood your ground. That's the bravest thing a man can do." He then stood and led the still-shaken horse to its stall, his movements once again calm and methodical. Alara ran to Caleb, hugging him tightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she finally looked up, Jed was standing at the corral gate, his gaze fixed on the dead snake. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold, hard certainty. He met her gaze across the dusty space that separated them, and in that shared look, the truth was laid bare. This was not bad luck. This was not a random act of nature. This was a message, delivered with venom and intended for a child. The fear that had been a constant hum now became a piercing shriek, but it was no longer a fear that isolated her. It was a fear they now shared. Their fragile arrangement, born of desperation and circumstance, had been forged by this moment into something harder, something stronger. They were no longer just an employer and her hired hand. They were allies, standing together on a piece of land that an enemy wanted. With a child they would both protect, no matter the cost. The fragile alliance forged in the face of a common threat was soon tested by a new kind of poison, one that seeped in not from the wild edges of their land, but from the heart of Crimson Peak itself. The town, under the subtle but pervasive influence of Silas Croft, had moved from quiet suspicion to open hostility. The change was palpable, a chilling shift in the social climate that Alara felt most keenly on her weekly trip for supplies. When she entered the general store, the familiar warmth of neighborly chatter evaporated, replaced by a stony silence. Women who had once shared recipes and gossip now turned their backs, their shoulders forming a wall of silent condemnation. The storekeeper, a man she had known since childhood, filled her order with brisk, impersonal efficiency, his eyes refusing to meet hers, his hands almost flinching when their fingers brushed as she paid. It was a quiet, bloodless shunning, but it cut deeper than any open insult, leaving her feeling like a ghost in her own town. The cruelty, however, was not reserved for her alone. It found its most vulnerable target in Caleb. He began returning from the one-room schoolhouse with his head hung low, a shadow in his eyes that had not been there before. First, it was small things, a torn collar on his shirt. His lunch pail accidentally kicked into the dust. Then, one afternoon, he came home with a darkening bruise high on his cheekbone, the faint imprint of knuckles visible in the swollen skin. He offered only a mumbled excuse about tripping and falling, but the lie was thin and brittle, and the shame in his eyes told the true story. He was paying the price for his mother's choice, for the presence of the quiet, haunted man who worked their land. Alara held him close that evening, her heart aching with a helplessness she had not felt even in the darkest days after her husband's passing. This was a wound she could not mend, a fight she did not know how to win. Jed saw it all, and the guilt settled in his soul like a shroud. Each silent meal, each averted gaze from the boy, was a fresh indictment. He had come to this place seeking nothing more than a chance to work, to be invisible. But he had instead become a catalyst for pain, a lightning rod drawing the town's fear and hatred down upon the only two people who had shown him a sliver of grace. He began to work with a feverish intensity, pushing himself from before dawn until long after dusk, as if he could physically build a fortress strong enough to keep the world's ugliness at bay. But with every fence post he set, with every roof shingle he nailed down, the question echoed in his mind: was he protecting this family? Or was he the very danger from which they needed protection? The ghosts of Yuma prison whispered to him in the lonely hours of the night, reminding him that his presence had brought ruin once before. The thought of leaving, of simply disappearing into the mountains to draw the fire away from them, became a constant, agonizing temptation. The weight of their isolation was given official voice by the arrival of Sheriff Maeve Riley. She rode out to the ranch one crisp autumn morning, a formidable figure whose authority came not just from the badge on her coat, but from the weary pragmatism in her steel-gray eyes. She was a woman who understood the vast difference between the law as it was written and justice as it was delivered in a town like Crimson Peak. She accepted Alara's offer of coffee but remained on the porch, her gaze sweeping over the ranch, noting the repairs, the quiet industry, and the watchful presence of Jed by the barn. "I'm not here on official business, Alara," she began, her voice direct and devoid of preamble. "I'm here as someone who knew your husband. Silas Croft has a long reach. He owns the bank that holds the note on this land. He has half the town council in his pocket, and folks are scared of him." She let the words settle, her eyes meeting Alara's with a look of grim understanding. "People are talking. They see this man." She nodded towards Jed. "A man with a history, and Croft is feeding their fear. They see you, a widow alone with a boy, and they're calling it a scandal. It's not right, but it's happening." She sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "What I'm telling you is this: the law is a flimsy shield out here. My authority extends only as far as folks are willing to respect it. You're making yourself a target, and I can't protect you from whispers. or from a banker calling in a loan, or from the kind of trouble that happens in the dead of night with no witnesses. Her visit was not a threat, but a warning, a stark and brutal assessment of their reality. When she rode away, she left behind a silence that was heavier and more complete than before, a silence filled with the crushing realization that they were well and truly on their own. The sheriff's words solidified the conflict raging within Jed. To stay was to invite disaster upon them. To leave was to abandon them to the wolves. The dilemma tore at him, leaving him withdrawn and silent. His inner turmoil visible only in the tightening of his jaw and the haunted look that settled deep in his eyes. The breaking point arrived a few days later. In the cavernous gloom of the barn, Jed was sharpening a set of tools, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. When shadows fell across the wide-open doorway, Bart Thorne stood there, flanked by two of his brutish ranch hands. They spread out, their bodies blocking the only exit, their smirks promising violence. "Working hard, killer," Thorne sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Making yourself at home, getting comfortable with the widow." Jed did not rise to the bait. He continued to draw the sharpening stone along the edge of a scythe blade. His movements slow and deliberate. Years of prison discipline had taught him to control the first hot flush of rage, to build a wall of ice around the inferno inside. "This is private property. Thorne," he said, his voice a low, even growl. "You're not welcome here." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the rafters. "We're just here to have a look around, make sure the boy is safe. A man like you, with your appetites. It ain't right, you being so close to a child." At that moment, Caleb, who had been sent to the barn to fetch a bucket, appeared in the doorway behind them, his eyes going wide with fear as he took in the scene. Thorne's grin widened. He turned and took a step toward the boy, his hand reaching out. "There he is now. Let's ask him what kind of lessons you've been teaching him." That was the line. The sight of that predatory hand reaching for the boy, the flash of terror in Caleb's eyes, it shattered Jed's icy control. A volcanic rage, black and absolute, erupted from the depths of his soul. The scythe dropped from his hands, clattering onto the dirt floor. The memory of another fight, another moment of lost control, the feel of a man's life ending beneath his hands, it all came flooding back. His fists clenched, his body coiled, and every instinct screamed for the brutal, final release of violence. He took a single step forward, a low snarl rising in his throat. This was the moment Thorne had engineered, the moment the monster would be unleashed for all to see. But then, through the red haze of his fury, he saw Alara standing just behind Caleb at the barn door, her face a pale mask of terror. He saw the two people who had looked past the killer and seen a man. And in that split second, a battle was fought and won within him. He forced the rage down, channeling the molten fury not into his fists, but into his voice. He stopped his advance, his body trembling with the colossal effort of restraint. And when he spoke, his voice was not a shout, but a blade of ice, deadly quiet and lethally sharp. "Touch him, Thorne," he whispered, and the whisper carried more menace than any yell. "And I will unmake you. I won't kill you. That's too quick. I will take you apart, piece by piece, and I will do it so slowly you'll forget what it feels like to not be in pain. Then I will leave what's left of you in a ditch for the buzzards to argue over." He held Thorne's gaze, and for the first time, the foreman saw not the cornered animal he had been prodding, but something far more terrifying, a man in absolute control of an immense capacity for violence. A man who was making a promise. The smirk vanished from Thorne's face, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He looked from Jed's cold, dead eyes to the two silent men behind him, who had also taken a half-step back, unnerved by the shift in the air. Thorne hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand. He spat on the ground, a last weak gesture of defiance. "You'll get what's coming to you, Stone," he muttered, before turning and striding out of the barn, his men following close behind like chastened dogs. The tension drained from the barn, leaving a vacuum in its wake. Jed stood, trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. He had won. But the victory felt perilously close to a defeat. He had stared into the abyss of his own past and had only just managed to pull back from the edge. He felt a small hand touch his. He looked down to see Caleb, his fear replaced by a look of silent, absolute awe. Then he looked up and met Alara's eyes. She crossed the space between them, her steps certain. She didn't speak. She simply raised a hand and gently touched the scar on his jawline, her fingers tracing the old wound. He flinched at the contact, but did not pull away. In that touch, he felt not pity or fear, but an acknowledgement of the battle he had just fought for them. For her. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart, walls built of stone and solitude, finally crumbled. She stepped closer, into the circle of his arms, and rested her head against his chest. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart, or perhaps it was his own. He slowly wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she were the only anchor in a world that had tried to tear him apart. It was not a kiss, not a grand declaration, but something more profound. A quiet, unconditional surrender to a feeling he never thought he would know again. In the dusty silence of the barn, surrounded by the scent of hay and horses, they were no longer just allies, they were survivors, bound together by a shared threat and a hard-won, terrifying, and beautiful hope. The aftermath of the confrontation left a fragile, altered stillness in its wake. The bond forged between Jed and Alara in that moment of shared crisis was a thing of profound, unspoken depth, a silent acknowledgement that their lives were now irrevocably intertwined. For a few brief days, a semblance of peace settled over the ranch. It was a peace marked by a new, quiet intimacy, a shared look across the dinner table that lasted a moment longer than necessary, the way Jed's hand would brush hers when he passed her a cup of coffee on the porch in the early morning light. The shared, weary smiles as they watched Caleb chasing fireflies in the dusk. It was a dangerous hope, a small, warm shelter built in the heart of a gathering storm, and both of them knew, with a grim certainty, that it could not last. The storm broke on a cold, gray morning. Sheriff Maeve Riley returned, but this time she was not alone. A nervous-looking deputy rode with her, and the finality in her expression spoke volumes before she even dismounted. She did not approach the porch for coffee. She stood by the gate, her hand resting on the Colt at her hip, her face a mask of official duty. "Jedediah Stone," she called out, her voice flat and carrying the weight of the law. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Alara, who had been coming from the house, froze, a basket of laundry dropping from her hands. Jed emerged from the barn, his face showing no surprise, only a deep, weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this very moment his entire life. He had spent years waiting for the past to finally catch up and drag him back into the dark. And now it was here. "On what charge?" Alara demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and fury as she moved to stand between Jed and the sheriff. "Assault," Riley answered, her gaze fixed on Jed. "Bart Thorne filed a formal complaint. He claims you threatened his life and attacked him without provocation in this very barn. He has 2 witnesses." The lie was so audacious, so grotesquely twisted, that for a moment Alara could only stare in stunned silence. Jed, however, simply nodded slowly. He understood the mechanics of this game perfectly. It was his word, the word of a convicted killer, against that of 3 men employed by the most powerful figure in the valley. The outcome was preordained. "I'll come peacefully," he said, and started walking towards the gate, his hands visible and away from his body. Before he reached the sheriff, he turned his head and met Alara's desperate gaze. He said nothing, but his eyes flickered for a fraction of a second towards the barn, towards the small corner where he slept and kept his few meager possessions. It was a silent message, a final, desperate act of faith placed in her hands. The small jail cell in Crimson Peak was a cage of cold stone and colder iron. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of past miseries. For Jed, the clang of the cell door locking shut was a sound that resonated deep in his bones, a sound he had prayed he would never hear again. He sat on the hard, narrow bunk, not with rage, but with a hollow, crushing despair. He had tried. He had served his time, had kept his head down, had fought to control the demons within him, and it had all been for nothing. He had allowed himself to hope, to feel the warmth of a home and a family, and in doing so, he had only succeeded in pulling them down with him. He was a disease, a blight, and everything he touched seemed to wither and die. As he stared at the sliver of gray sky visible through the high, barred window, he felt the last embers of his own hope finally turn to ash. Back at the ranch, Alara's grief quickly burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard fury unlike anything she had ever known. She would not be a victim. She would not let Croft and his lies destroy the good. Quiet man who had shown her son more kindness in a few months than the whole town had in years. She remembered Jed's final, fleeting glance, and a desperate purpose took hold of her. In the barn, in the small, tidy space Jed had made his own, she found his bedroll and a small wooden crate containing his possessions, a spare shirt, a sharpening stone, a worn copy of a book of poems, and, at the bottom, what she was looking for. There was a small collection of legal texts, their covers worn from countless hours of study by lamplight in a prison library, and tucked within them, a leather-bound journal filled with Jed's neat, precise handwriting. She spent the entire day and long into the night in the dim, lantern-lit barn, the world outside ceasing to exist. The journal was not a diary of feelings, but a meticulous record of a mind trying to make sense of a corrupt world. It was filled with notes on territorial statutes, water rights, and the predatory tactics of land acquisition companies. It was a chronicle of Jed's attempt to arm himself with knowledge, the only weapon a man like him could possess, tucked into the back of a heavy book on property law. Her fingers found a folded, brittle piece of paper. It was a surveyor's map, older and more detailed than any she had seen before. On it, the proposed route for the Montana Central Railroad was clearly marked, a thick black line that cut directly through the valley, and marked with a small, circled star, right in the center of her own property, was the words primary water source, year-round flow. The cold, calculated reason for Croft's relentless pressure was suddenly laid bare. He wasn't just trying to steal her home, he was positioning himself to hold the future of the entire territory for ransom. The discovery sent a chill down her spine, but it was the next one that stopped her heart. Near the end of the journal, she found a faded newspaper clipping, carefully folded and tucked into a small envelope. The headline was from a town in the Arizona Territory, dated 5 years earlier, "Local man dies after saloon altercation." She read the short, brutal article about a card game, a heated argument, and a man named Rufus McCord who died from a head injury. The man charged, it said, was a young ranch hand named Jedediah Stone. Her breath caught in her throat, but it was Jed's notes on the pages surrounding the clipping that contained the true revelation. He had chronicled his own investigation, notes on another case years before his own, in which a different family had been forced off their land by a series of violent threats. The name of the enforcer hired by the land company to do the dirty work was Rufus McCord. Her hands shaking, she turned the page and found the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It was a transcription of a legal document, a deed transfer for that very property, signed over to a holding company whose primary investor was listed as a young, ambitious businessman named Silas Croft. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The story Jed carried, the one that had defined him as a killer, was a lie. He hadn't killed a man in a drunken brawl. He had, in a tragic twist of fate, stood up to the same kind of predator who was now trying to destroy her. A hired thug working for the very same man. He wasn't just a victim of Croft's present-day scheme. He was a ghost from Croft's criminal past. A loose end the man had likely never expected to see again, armed with a truth that was both terrible and liberating. Alara knew what she had to do. She gathered the map, the journal, and the brittle newspaper clipping. Her movements filled with a cold, righteous purpose. She rode into Crimson Peak not as a supplicant, but as a warrior. She did not stop at the general store or the post office. She went directly to the sheriff's office, the dust of the trail still on her clothes, her face set in lines of grim determination. She found Maeve Riley at her desk, buried in paperwork. The sheriff looked up, her expression weary, prepared for another round of pleading. But she saw something different in Alara's eyes this time, not desperation, but fire. Alara strode to the desk and, without a word, laid the evidence out on the worn wood, the map. The journal opened to the damning pages, the yellowed clipping. "This is what this is about," she said, her voice low and steady, vibrating with suppressed rage. "It's not about a fistfight in a barn. It's about water and railroads and a history of theft that goes back years. It's about the man in your jail cell not being the criminal here." Sheriff Riley stared at the evidence, her professional skepticism slowly giving way to a dawning horror as she connected the pieces. She read the notes, traced the route on the map, and then read the newspaper clipping, her mouth setting into a thin, hard line. She looked up at Alara, whose fierce, unwavering gaze challenged her to her very core. "You have to let him go," Alara said, pressing her advantage. "This is proof." The sheriff leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking in the silent room. "This is proof of a motive. Alara, it's compelling. But it doesn't change the fact that I have a sworn statement from 3 men. Alara slammed her hand down on the desk, the sound making the sheriff flinch. "A statement from a man who put a rattlesnake in my corral. A statement bought and paid for by Silas Croft. I am not asking you to bend the law. I am asking you to enforce it. The real law, not the one Croft keeps in his pocket. Who do you work for? Sheriff him, or the people of this territory?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Maeve Riley's honor, to the very meaning of the badge she wore. The sheriff was silent for a long, heavy moment, her gaze distant. She was a pragmatist, a survivor. She knew the power Croft wielded. To move against him was to risk her career, her safety, perhaps even her life. But as she looked at the evidence before her, and at the fierce, unyielding courage of the woman who had brought it, she knew she had reached a crossroads. She could continue to keep the peace in a town rotting from the inside out. Or she could do her job. She stood up, her decision made. She walked to the key rack on the wall, took down a heavy iron key, and strode towards the cells in the back without a word. She unlocked Jed's cell door, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet building. Jed looked up from the bunk, his face a mask of confusion. "You're free to go, Stone," the sheriff said, her voice all business. "But you're not leaving Crimson Peak. Get back to the ranch and stay there. This is far from over." As Jed stepped out into the office, blinking in the light, he saw Alara standing there, her face tear-streaked but triumphant. Before either of them could speak, the sheriff brushed past them and sat down at the telegraph desk, her fingers beginning to tap out a message with swift, angry precision, a message addressed to the United States Marshal Service in the territorial capital of Helena. The war for the Vance Ranch had just become a war for the soul of the valley. The 3 days following Jed's release were a period of profound and heavy silence, a tense interlude where the world seemed to hold its breath. Back at the ranch, the air was thick with unspoken anticipation. Jed, Alara, and Caleb moved through their daily chores with a quiet, focused purpose. Their small family unit now a tightly knit core of resistance against the storm they knew was about to break. There was a new current running between Jed and Alara, a deep and steady river of trust that flowed beneath the surface of their shared anxiety. They spoke little of the coming confrontation, for there was nothing left to say. The truth was now a weapon in their hands, and all that remained was the battle itself. Jed spent the time reinforcing a corral gate and oiling harnesses, his hands finding solace in familiar work, while Alara mended clothes and prepared what food they had, her movements deliberate and calm, belying the furious hope that beat within her chest. The day of the town meeting dawned cold and clear, the sky a hard, brilliant blue. By mid-morning, the main street of Crimson Peak was more crowded than it had been for any holiday or celebration. People gathered in nervous, murmuring clusters, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a faint, long-suppressed flicker of hope. These were the ranchers who had been squeezed by Croft's predatory loans, the shopkeepers who depended on his business, the women who had shunned Alara, and the ordinary folk who had learned long ago that the safest path was to keep their heads down and their opinions to themselves. They stood together now in the crisp autumn air, a silent, uncertain jury, waiting for a trial that would determine the future of their town. Silas Croft arrived precisely on time, not as an accused man, but as a king coming to hold court. He sat in his polished buggy, Bart Thorne at his side, surveying the crowd with an air of absolute, unassailable confidence. He believed this gathering was his own creation, A stage set for the final. Public humiliation of the widow who had defied him and the convict who had stood in his way. He ascended the steps of the land office, a self-appointed judge on a wooden throne, and raised his hands for silence. His voice, when it came, was smooth and resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He spoke of community, of decency, of protecting their families from dangerous outside elements. He painted Jed as a violent drifter who had preyed on a vulnerable woman, and Alara as a fool who had endangered her own son and the moral fabric of the town. It was a masterful performance, a snake oil sermon of fear and prejudice. As Croft's rhetoric reached its crescendo, the heavy door of the sheriff's office opened. Maeve Riley stepped out, her face impassive. She did not raise her voice, she simply stood there, a silent, immovable object of the law. Until Croft's speech faltered under the weight of her stare. "This isn't a sermon, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with calm authority. "This is a public hearing, and the other parties have a right to be heard." She nodded towards the edge of the crowd, and a path slowly opened. Jed and Alara walked through the silent sea of people, with Caleb holding tightly to his mother's hand. They did not look like villains or fools. Alara's face was composed, her eyes burning with a cold fire. Jed stood tall, his gaze steady. A quiet man who had carried the weight of a lie for 5 years and was now ready to lay it down. They stopped at the bottom of the steps, standing on the same level as the townspeople, looking up at the man who had tried to ruin them. "You have something to say, Mrs. Vance," Croft sneered, his confidence barely dented. Alara stepped forward, holding up the surveyor's map. "This is what you really want, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and strong, reaching every corner of the square. "Not my small ranch, but the water that runs through it, the water the railroad will pay a fortune for." A ripple of understanding went through the crowd as she explained the scheme. Her words simple, direct, and devastatingly logical. Croft's face tightened, but he managed a dismissive laugh. "The desperate fantasies of a woman about to lose her land. You have no proof." "But I do," a quiet voice said. It was Jed. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, holding the worn, yellowed newspaper clipping. He did not address Croft, he addressed the town. "5 years ago, I was in a saloon in Arizona. I got into a fight with a man named Rufus McCord. He died, and I went to prison for it. I've never denied that." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. "What I didn't know until now was who McCord really was. He wasn't just a card player, he was a hired bully. A man who worked for a land company that was forcing good people off their property with threats and violence." He held up the clipping. "And the man who owned that company, the man who paid Rufus McCord to do his dirty work, was a younger but no less greedy Silas Croft." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The accusation was monstrous, connecting the town's powerful leader to a dead man in another territory. Croft's face, for the first time, lost its confident smirk, replaced by a mask of incandescent fury. "Lies," he roared. "The pathetic lies of a cornered killer? Who will you believe, a pillar of this community? Or this animal?" A tense silence fell. The townspeople looked at each other, their fear of Croft warring with the undeniable ring of truth in Jed's words. It was in that moment of fragile indecision that a new voice spoke, thin but clear. "He's telling the truth." An old rancher named Abe, a man who had lost his own wife's family plot to one of Croft's foreclosures years ago, stepped forward from the crowd. "Croft sent men to my place, too. Said the fence line was wrong, that my cattle were grazing on his land. Offered to buy me out for pennies on the dollar to avoid trouble. It was the same story." Abe's courage was a spark in a tinderbox. A woman sobbed and pointed at Thorne. "His men spooked my herd last spring, drove half of them off a ravine." Another man, the blacksmith, spoke up. "He threatened to triple the price on coal if I shod the Vance woman's horses." One by one, the stories came out. A flood of suppressed injustices and quiet terrors. The people of Crimson Peak finally finding their collective voice. The dam of fear that Silas Croft had so carefully constructed for years crumbled into dust in a matter of minutes. His power was not in his wealth. It was in their silence. And their silence was now broken. As Croft stood, his face pale with disbelief and rage, unable to stop the tide of accusations, a new presence made itself known. Four men, their faces hard and unfamiliar, emerged from the edge of the crowd. They moved with a quiet, confident purpose, their long dusters failing to conceal the badges pinned to their vests and the well-oiled Colts on their hips. They were led by a tall, grim-faced man who walked directly to the steps of the land office, his eyes never leaving Croft. "Silas Croft," the lead marshal said, his voice as cold and final as a jail cell door. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, you are under arrest." He unrolled a warrant, the paper crackling in the stunned silence. "The charges are conspiracy to defraud, extortion, and mail fraud in connection with the Montana Central Railroad land acquisition." The color drained completely from Croft's face. He looked from the marshal to the crowd of faces that were no longer frightened, but empowered. His empire, built on lies and intimidation, had evaporated before his very eyes. As one of the marshals snapped iron cuffs onto his wrists, another did the same for a stunned and sputtering Bart Thorne. The tyrants of Crimson Peak were tyrants no more. A slow, hesitant cheer started at the back of the crowd, then grew into a wave of cathartic, joyful relief. The long winter of fear was finally over, amid the celebration. Jed and Alara stood quietly, Caleb between them. The townspeople began to approach them, one by one. Abe the rancher shook Jed's hand, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude. The storekeeper's wife touched Alara's arm, her face etched with shame. "We're sorry," she whispered. "We were afraid." There were no grand speeches of forgiveness, only quiet nods of understanding. As Jed looked out at the faces of the people who had once shunned him, he felt not triumph, but a deep and profound sense of peace. He was no longer an outcast, no longer defined by the worst moment of his life. He was just a man, standing with his family, at the heart of a town that was, for the first time, truly free. Alara Vance, soon to be Alara Stone, stood on the porch of her home and knew that the land had not just shaped her fate, but had blessed it. 6 months had passed since the day the truth had set their town free. The harsh, biting winds of autumn had given way to a gentle spring that breathed new life into the valley. The creek, the source of so much strife, now gurgled happily, its waters nourishing the fields of new grass that carpeted the landscape in a vibrant, impossible green. The Vance Ranch was no longer a place of struggle and solitude. It was thriving. The barn roof solid, the fences strong, and the air filled not with tension, but with the sounds of laughter and fiddle music that carried on the warm breeze. Today, the ranch was the heart of the entire community, the townspeople of Crimson Peak, the same faces that had once turned away in judgment, now filled her yard, their hands laden with pies, smoked meats, and jars of preserves. They had come to celebrate the wedding of the two people who had reminded them of their own courage. Children ran in laughing packs through the tall grass, their games joyful and carefree. With Caleb, his face bright with an uncomplicated happiness, in their midst, it was a scene of such profound peace and communal warmth that it felt like a dream, a testament to the healing that had taken place not just on her land, but in the souls of the people who lived on it. Jed stood at the far end of the porch, watching the scene, a quiet stillness about him. He wore a new suit, a gift from the town tailor, but he looked most at home with his gaze on the land he had helped to rebuild. He was a different man from the haunted stranger who had ridden into town half a year ago. The hard, guarded lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence. He was no longer a man defined by the walls of a prison cell, but by the wide, open spaces of the home he had earned. He saw Sheriff Maeve Riley talking with Abe the rancher, their laughter genuine, the law now a comfortable and welcome presence. He saw the storekeeper's wife press a jar of honey into Alara's hands, a small, simple gesture that spoke volumes of apology and acceptance. Alara came and stood beside him, her simple white dress seeming to capture the light of the morning sun. She slipped her hand into his, their fingers lacing together with a natural, practiced ease. He looked down at her, and in her eyes, he saw not the shadow of his past, but the bright promise of their future. It was time. They turned to face the small crowd as the local preacher, a man who had once warned Alara against the devil in her midst, cleared his throat and smiled, ready to sanctify the union he now saw as a blessing. Caleb came to stand between them, proudly holding the two simple gold bands that would bind their family together. There were no grand, eloquent vows spoken. Their promises to each other had already been made in moments of shared fear, in acts of quiet labor, and in the silent, steadfast defense of their home and their son. As Jed took her hand, he thought of the long, lonely road that had brought him here, a path of dust and regret that he had thought would have no end. He had arrived seeking only shelter, and instead, he had found a sanctuary. He had hoped only for a second chance, and had been given a new life. He looked at Caleb, who beamed up at him with absolute trust, and he knew that the hole in his own soul, a void carved out by loss and loneliness, was finally full. He was no longer just a man, he was a husband and a father. As Alara repeated her vows, her voice soft but steady, she looked at the man before her. She saw the strength that had been tempered in the fires of hardship, the gentleness that he had so carefully shielded from a harsh world, and the unwavering loyalty he had shown to her and her son. She had offered a job to a desperate stranger, and in return, he had given her back her home, her hope, and her heart. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the gathered crowd, a joyful, heartfelt sound that echoed off the mountains. Jed knelt down and pulled Caleb into a fierce hug, before rising to kiss his bride, sealing their new beginning in front of the community that was now, truly, their own. Later that evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold, the three of them walked to the small hill that overlooked the ranch. The sounds of the celebration below faded into a gentle hum, leaving them in a world of their own. They stood together, a small family silhouetted against the vast, beautiful expanse of the Montana sky. Caleb leaned against Jed's side, tired and happy, while Alara rested her head on his shoulder, his arm holding her close. They watched the warm lights flicker on in the windows of their house, a beacon of the life they had built together. "Do you ever think about the day you rode in?" Alara asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jed was quiet for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the valley, the fences he had mended, the barn he had repaired, the home he now shared. "I think about it every day," he answered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and the ghosts in my head. I thought my life was over." He turned to look at her, his eyes shining in the twilight. "You saw a man worth saving when I couldn't even see a man worth feeding." She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I saw a man who knew how to build things," she said. "I just didn't know the best thing he'd ever build would be a family." He held them tighter, his wife and his son, and looked out at the land. The last sliver of sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, and the first stars began to appear, cold and bright in the deepening twilight. Jedediah Stone, the ex-convict, the outcast, the killer, was gone. In his place stood a husband, a father, a rancher, a good man who had found his redemption not in forgiveness from the world but in the love of a family. He had, at long last, come home.